Welcome to this RSA webinar following the US presidential election last week, with President-elect Trump winning not only the Electoral College but also the popular vote, as well as the Republicans securing a majority in the Senate and looking likely to do the same in the House of Representatives. What does this decisive election victory mean for the world? Following a long series of catastrophic misadventures in the Middle East over the last 2 decades, the American foreign policy community has tried to understand what went wrong. After weighing the evidence, they have mostly advised a retreat from the region. The basic view is that when the United States tries to advance change in the Middle East, it only makes matters worse. But with conflicts in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, complex and important relationships with key regional players like Saudi Arabia, and the myriad ways in which the region is linked to global geopolitical, economic, and security issues, is withdrawal really an option for the United States? We're fortunate to have Stephen Cook joining us today to help us make sense of what this election result means for US foreign policy toward the Middle East and America's role in the region under a second Trump presidency. Stephen Cook is the Eni Enrique Mate Senior Fellow for Middle East and African Studies and Director of the International Affairs Fellowship for Tenured International Relations Scholars at the Council of Foreign Relations in the United States. He is an expert on Arab and Turkish politics, as well as US Middle East policy. Among several other titles, he is the author of the recently published book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East, which presents a vision for the United States' role in the Middle East and highlights the changing nature of US national interests and the challenges of grand strategizing at a time of profound change in the international order. As ever, we'll have time following Stephen's talk for Q&A, so if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Stephen to deliver his lecture.
Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you very much, Charlie, for the very, very kind invitation today. It's a great pleasure to talk about the Middle East in relation to my book. I just want to say that I'm in awe of your accent. If not for a number of decisions on the part of a variety of uncles and so on and so forth, I would sound like that too. Instead, I sound like a kid from New York. In any event, as Charlie mentioned in his very, very kind introduction, the American foreign policy community has basically been engaged in an exercise of reevaluation over the course of the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years about the American approach to the Middle East. And overall, the idea of retrenchment or withdrawal has captured the imagination of both the American foreign policy community, as well as, I should say, the American public. After all, Americans have elected 3 presidents in a row who have sought to get out of the Middle East or otherwise de-emphasize it. President Barack Obama, who was critical even before the American invasion of Iraq of American foreign policy in the Middle East. President Donald Trump, who articulated in very different ways, but articulated a very similar type of desire to leave the Middle East as President Obama, and of course President Biden, who picked up the mantle of ending forever wars, withdrew the United States from Afghanistan, which is, of course, not a Middle Eastern country, but nevertheless was part of this broader debate about the American role in the region and the world. And he had sought to de-emphasize the Middle East. All while this was going on, I was formulating the questions, the major intellectual questions for the book, whose cover is right behind my right shoulder here, in seeking to understand a number of things. First, why had the United States failed so terribly in the Middle East? And as I embarked upon that question, answering that question and doing the research to answer that question, the project became much, much more interesting to me because it became clear to me that failure was not always a feature of American foreign policy in the Middle East, but there was actually a time when the United States was actually pretty successful in the Middle East. And so this became, as I said, an even more interesting project for me. What changed? How was it that the United States was successful? What changed that made it unsuccessful? and what should the United States do about it? And that's essentially the arc of my book, The End of Ambition. And I'll start from the end and say that indeed the United States does have a role to play in the Middle East. President Obama's pivot to Asia, the idea of retrenchment or offshore balancing, to me seems like too radical solution for what has happened to the United States in the Middle East. But now let me go backwards. And let me talk about a period of time when the United States was actually rather successful in the region. Now, if we were all together and not meeting virtually, I would stop this talk and I would ask you if you knew what America's core interests were in the Middle East from 1945 to 1991, but really between 1970 and 1991. And people would raise their hands and give me all kinds of answers. Certainly, Americans, including American diplomats, have a hard time zeroing in on what America's core interests were during that period. And I think that's a function of Washington's overambition in the region beginning in the 1990s, that people can't actually identify what the core interests of the United States had traditionally been. And what I do in the book is I lay out essentially three core interests. The first being what I call the prime directive, which is preventing threats to the free flow of energy resources out of the Middle East. The second is helping to prevent threats to Israeli security. And the third is preventing any single state or combination of states of challenging American predominance in the region in the service of those other two interests. That's it. Very, very narrow. Interest is a very slippery type of concept. And people fall into tautological reasoning when it comes to a discussion of interest. And the way in which I define the interest in the book is a way to get around that by demonstrating that over a long period of time, Americans were willing to invest in, defend, and sacrifice for those three interests. And by and large, the United States was successful by dint of what policymakers wanted to do in the Middle East, which was to defend those three interests, and what Americans were willing to do. The oil flowed, Israel remained secure, and the United States was predominant. Now, that's not to suggest that the United States was always successful or that there weren't costs to these policies. There were setbacks. The October 1973 war, in which there was an oil embargo put on the United States and others who supported Israel in that conflict. The Iranian Revolution of 1978, 1979 was a setback. There are moral costs associated with the political order that the United States helped create in the Middle East that was composed primarily of authoritarian countries. These are leaders who do not share American values, principles at all. In fact, in some cases, quite the opposite of the ideals by which Americans like to live. And there were clearly moral costs associated with that. And then moral costs associated with support for Israel, which is primarily the permanent statelessness of the Palestinian people who have been living under Israeli occupation for 57 years. And those who are not living under Israeli occupation are either citizens of the state of Israel, but face institutional discrimination, and or they are refugees outside of their historic homeland. All of these things we need to acknowledge, which Americans don't often acknowledge, particularly the people within the foreign policy community, but they must be acknowledged. At the same time, recognizing that in this moment, arguably between in the post-World War II era, but particularly in starting in the 1970s when the British withdrew east of Suez, the United States became more active in the region, particularly when it came to the free flow of energy resources. And as a result, and the result was overall a success for the United States. Well, what changed? Once again, if we were all together, I would ask you what happened on February 26, 1991. I've been somewhat struck by the fact that very few in my talks about my book in New York, Washington, Boston, Dallas, Santa Fe, Tulsa, Oklahoma, San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles. Very, very few people get this question right. What happened on February 26, 1991? And that was when Saddam Hussein waved the white flag, and the United States and the coalition it led in Operation Desert Storm prevailed and restored Kuwaiti sovereignty. The next question that I ask audiences is what happened on December 26, 1991, exactly 10 months after the victory in Operation Desert Storm. Once again, I'm struck by the fact, and I'm even more struck by the fact that people don't remember this, it was the official end of the Soviet Union. The hammer and sickle came down over the Kremlin for the very last time. You can watch it on YouTube. It's a fascinating, almost 2 minutes piece of history that you can relive over and over and over again. And what these two victories did was essentially unleash the United States. The sober statesmen like George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft began thinking broader about what they called the possibilities for American power in the world and what this would mean for a new world. I'm not saying that President George H.W. Bush meant transformation when he talked about the New World Order. But nevertheless, if you read his memoir that he wrote alongside of Brent Scowcroft, which is called A World Transformed, both he and Scowcroft, like I said, you could not find more sober statesmen in the American foreign policy community at the time. And since then, began dreaming big dreams about the United States. And if you remember back into the mid-1990s, we Americans then elected President Bill Clinton, who was in his 40s at the time. The theme song to his campaign was Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow by the band Fleetwood Mac. There was this very positive, triumphant zeitgeist at the time. Despite bruising debates, we extended NATO, we engaged in economic shock therapy. Recent college graduates of my generation fanned out across the former communist states of Eastern and Central Europe to teach English, to teach people how to be journalists, to do all kinds of things in the service of American globalization. And back in Washington, one of the priorities for the Clinton administration was essentially the transformation of the Middle East. President Clinton is quoted as saying that it was his goal to pull the countries of the Middle East into the 21st century. And the way that he would do that was through a peace process. Bringing peace between Israelis and Palestinians, which would be an overall good, would also have a transformational effect on the large national security states of the surrounding Arab states. It sounded like elegant and eloquent sequencing that makes sense in a conference room in Washington, D.C., but it misapprehended the reason why there are large national security states in the Arab world. Nevertheless, that was an underlying rationale of Clinton's peace process. Then, of course, we have the George W. Bush administration. Even before the attacks on New York and Washington on September 11th, President George W. Bush turned Clinton's logic on his head and said that the way to get peace was through reform, and that it was an official policy of the United States to push the political reform of the Palestinian Authority, believing that democratization would ensure peaceful coexistence between Israel and Palestine. Then, of course, we have the attacks on 9/11, which allowed the United States policymakers to operationalize many of the things that were debated and discussed in Washington, D.C. throughout the 1990s with regard to Iraq and the transformation of the Middle East. I'll remind folks that the Iraq Liberation Act, which had bipartisan support in the Congress, was signed by President Bill Clinton in 1998. It is a predicate, a legal predicate of sorts for the liberation of Iraq, which the George W. Bush administration undertook in 2003. Now, critics will suggest, well, yes, there was this invasion of Iraq, but it was really about disarming Iraq, which was portrayed as a unique threat to global security. That's absolutely the case. But when Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, suggested just putting another Iraqi general in the chair in Baghdad, President George W. Bush said, no, we're not going to undertake this mission and leave the Iraqi people to the predations of yet another authoritarian. We are going to make a democracy out of Iraq, and that will have a dynamic effect on the rest of the region. Obviously, by the time the end of George W. Bush's term in office, we neither had a reformed Palestinian Authority and a Palestinian state, as the Clinton administration had envisioned. Iraq was chaotic and murderous, and there had been no success in pushing democratic reform in the region. And then came President Barack Obama, who was opposed to this ambitious agenda for the United States in the Middle East, in particular, Operation Iraqi Freedom. But once the Arab uprisings began, President Obama began to sound like his predecessor. In May of 2011, he went to the State Department and gave a speech that could have been written by President George W. Bush's speechwriters, talking about now the United States doesn't need to settle for the way the world is, but can make the world as it ought to be. Of course, this was somewhat consistent with what President Obama had said when he went to Cairo early on in his first term and spoke to a large audience at Cairo University, in which he said that the United States would drop George W. Bush's freedom agenda, but if countries became democracies, the United States would help it. As a result, President Obama put the United States back in the democracy promotion business. But I think the more transformative effort on the part of the Obama administration was actually the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The hunch at the heart of this deal was that, one, the United States and Iran would have better relations, and that Iran wanted better relations with the United States as a result of the JCPOA, and that the JCPOA would fundamentally transform the regional order. If you read Jeffrey Goldberg's rather astonishing interview with President Obama late in President Obama's second term, he talks about how the Saudis and others will have to learn how to share the region with the Iranians. The JCPOA was a centerpiece of forcing the Saudis and others to share the region with the Iranians so that the United States could pivot to Asia and the greener pastures of pursuing opportunities in Asia. Of course, President Trump had very, very different ideas about this. But the point of this narrative here is to demonstrate that Democrats, Republicans, Clinton, Bush, Obama, even President Biden sought transformation of the region, despite his desire and his talk about ending endless wars, by having, at least initially, a values-forward foreign policy in which American values would inform all aspects of American foreign policy, but particularly in the Middle East. This is a bipartisan effort to engage in the transformation of the region, and the return on America's investment over the course of these 25, 30 years has been zero, or less than zero. Palestinians are further away from a Palestinian state and justice. No Arab country has become a democracy for as a result of American efforts. And the one country that was portrayed as the Arab Spring success story, and the Arab Spring had nothing to do with American policy, is once again back to where it was in December 2010, and that's Tunisia, which is once again under the rule of an authoritarian with a well-developed police state. Iraq is no longer under Saddam Hussein, but it is unstable and dangerous. There has been really the American vision for the region has been thwarted at every turn, and as I said, the United States has wasted tremendous amount of resources seeking the transformation of the region. So the question is, well, now what? And the book, in the last chapter of the book, is an effort to demonstrate that there is a role for the United States in the Middle East. But it is my pleading to policymakers to understand actually what's important to the United States. That if the United States understands what's actually important to the United States and understands that when the United States tries to prevent bad things from happening to its interests in the region, it is more successful, potentially more constructive than leveraging American power to make good things happen in the region. And we see that very, very clearly. This isn't a recommendation that the United States just follow the patterns of American foreign policy that it pursued 1945 to 1991. That would be ridiculous. The world is a very, very different place. But what it is saying at a level of abstraction, the United States needs to understand the world as it is, not as Americans would like it to be, understand what's important to us, and devote resources to achieving those goals. And if those goals are unachievable, to reassess what those goals are and in order to determine what the United States can do. This is to understand the limits of American power. Now, the original title for the last chapter of the book was called Searching for Goldilocks in the Middle East. And the underlying theme of the chapter is not too much United States and not too little United States. That is, that the Middle East is truly the middle, and that the United States has a series of interests and goals in the region that demand America's attention, but not the kind of attention that the United States devoted to the region in 30 years. Now, I really don't want to give it all away. I recognize that there are 36 people here, and there may be a book sale here or there, but I'll give you a flavor of what I argue. I essentially lay out 6 goals or interests for the United States going forward. Some of them are very familiar, like counterterrorism. My pleading on counterterrorism, for example, though, is just for administrations to read their own counterterrorism strategy, and the United States would be better off. Americans don't know that there are 500 American soldiers operating in Somalia in this day. No one actually understands that, and it's not actually consistent with our counterterrorism strategies as laid out by a series of presidents. Another familiar interest would be continuing the American effort to prevent the threats to the free flow of energy resources out of the Middle East. We have made great strides in terms of alternative energy, but we are a long way away from decarbonizing our economy and our society and our world. And as a result, the United States still has a compelling interest to ensure energy resources and freedom of navigation in and around the waterways of the Middle East. That is something that there are some Americans, including those who support the president-elect, believe that the United States can pump its own oil and gas out of that interest. However, we live in a global marketplace, and when there is a negative effect on oil supplies in some other part of the world, it's going to have an impact on prices and prices for Americans at the pump, and that's something that they care very, very deeply about. So the United States will continue its mission to help ensure the free flow of energy resources out of the region, both for national interest as well as a given president's parochial political interest. Then there is, of course, the current third rail of American foreign policy in the Middle East, which is American support for Israel. And what I say there is that everything that President Biden has done over the course of the last 14 months is perfectly consistent with American foreign policy, and that there is good reason to continue to have a strong relationship with Israel, but that relationship has to change for 2 reasons. One, the politics of the U.S.-Israel relationship is changing in the United States. If you pay careful attention to the polls and debates, at least on one side of the aisle, the Democratic Party is divided over this issue. But more importantly, Israel doesn't need American largesse any longer. Prior to the conflict that began on October 7th with Hamas's attacks on southern Israel, Israel had a GDP per capita of about $52,000 a year, which is more than some of Washington's NATO allies. nowhere is it written that the United States should underwrite Israel's defense budgets in perpetuity. And although the two countries are important to each other, it is now time to wean the Israelis from American largesse over a decade and replace that with security pacts and other types of diplomatic agreements that facilitate technology sharing and defense cooperation between the two countries. Other interests that I talk about are climate, but not climate in terms of climate conflict or mitigating the climate, but actually using America's expertise to prevent mass migration of people out of the region and into Europe and other areas. I'll leave you to read the book to understand more of that. And then, of course, great power competition in the region. I'm somewhat skeptical of the kind of anti-China mania that has gripped Washington over the last number of years. But it's clear that China is a rising power. The United States is a status quo power. There is bound to be competition and tension between the two, and that the United States needs to prepare for this. And because if you look at the map, the Middle East is genuinely the middle between Beijing and Washington. And because the Middle East is important to both countries for a variety of important reasons, including reasons that overlap with each other, free flow of energy resources, freedom of navigation, the two countries are going to bump up against each other in the region and compete for influence there. And I have a number of ideas how the United States should handle that. But I'll leave that to readers of the book. Overall, the argument is that the United States should not withdraw from the Middle East. The United States should not retrench from the Middle East. That offshore balancing has proven to be incapable and did not work when the United States tried it during the Nixon era. And that there are ways for the United States to be in the region, to understand what's important to us, to prevent challenges to those things that are important to us, and ultimately we're likely to be more constructive. It's most important that Americans see the world as it is, not the way we want it to be, because when we do the latter, we tend to make things worse. As the United States does try to transform the region or tries to leave the region, regional partners will start to hedge with China and Russia and other global powers. That's not good for the United States. I'll end there. I look forward to discussing these issues with you in Q&A. So, Charlie, back to you.
That's great. Thank you very much for a fascinating and, as we said earlier, timely talk given the election last week. So just to kick off, I've got a question from the audience, which is really about Russia's role in the Middle East, especially in places like Syria and its collaboration with Iran as well. And how does Russia feature in the way that the US looks at the Middle East?
Yeah, it's interesting that, Russia has made this return to the region. And in fact, the support for the Assad regime was something that contributed to the mystique of Vladimir Putin in the Middle East for a number of years. Contrast Putin's rescue of the Assad regime to President Barack Obama's demand on Hosni Mubarak, a leader who had been carrying America's water in the Middle East for 30 years, much to his domestic political detriment at times. President Obama's demand that there be a transition from Mubarak after 2 weeks of protests against him. And so whether leaders in the region liked Assad or not, they respected Putin. And that has given the Russians an entree and influence throughout the region, even among America's partners. And then, of course, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has not gone as well as the Russians had hoped. They have become dependent upon the Iranians for military technology and have promised the Iranians military technology in return. And in fact, in retaliation for America's support for Ukraine, there is some concern that the Russians will supply military equipment or at least targeting information for the Houthis in Yemen against shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. you have to give the Russians credit. They made a lot out of nothing. This is a country whose economy is probably the size of the economy of New York State, which is basically the economy of New York City and the New York metropolitan area. I don't know what the equivalent of that would be in Europe, but clearly not the economic powerhouse that is the United States or China or the European Union writ large. Um, what the Russians really have in the Middle East is what one of my colleagues, a guy named Brian Katulis, has termed troll power. And that is that the Russians have this ability to highlight the gap between America's principles, ideals, its rhetoric about what it does in the world and what it actually does in the world. And that is the Middle East is particularly fertile area for that because of the overambitious effort to transform the region over the course of the previous 25 or 30 years. I think the Russians, because they are essentially a single crop economy under a dictatorship, there is a certain affinity between some governments in the region and the Russians, but I don't see them as significant a factor over a longer period of time in the Middle East as I do, for example, as I see the Chinese or even the Indians, to be completely honest with you, a major global power that people tend to forget, and that countries, particularly in the Gulf as well as Israel, are very, very interested in forging close, with which they're interested in close, very, very close ties.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so, sort of to piggyback on that, is the look at China. The new Secretary of State, whenever they're announced and when they come in, what are the things they're going to be looking at? What are the touch points that they need to be paying attention to going in the Middle East?
I mean, look, the Chinese are a major factor in the region. I mean, yeah, every time someone says, well, China is the largest trading partner with Egypt or Saudi Arabia. Well, China's the largest trading partner with the United States, the largest trading partner with virtually everyone. Um, and the United States had been it'd been a real problem for the United States to harangue its partners in the region about using Chinese technology in their telecommunication systems, but not have anything to offer our partners in response. It was a mistake for the United States to harangue its partners in the region about the state of their politics. That is to say that they were not democratic or they weren't reforming. Not to say that I'm against, I always want a president of the United States to talk about freedom in the world and so on and so forth. But if you're going to be in competition with a rising global power, and that rising global power isn't really terribly interested in that issue, but you don't want your partners to be hedging with that partner, you probably should be more careful about haranguing your partners about the fact that they are human rights violators and non-democracies. As terrible as that sounds, that has only driven countries in that direction. Now, I think the Biden administration has come around to some of these ideas. There now is a Western, if not American, option to other than Huawei. The United States has helped Microsoft invest in the UAE, as long as the UAE divests of certain Chinese investments in the tech sector in the UAE. The entire effort on the part of the United States to clinch a security pact with the Saudis is in part an effort to outmaneuver the Chinese. It is not just a security pact. It is a pact about technology, about nuclear technology, a pact about a variety of issues that are clearly designed to outmaneuver the Chinese in the region. Now, of course, the Saudis say, look, we'd love this pact. This is great. A security pact with the United States makes life much more difficult for Tehran. And we are all in with the United States on AI and other advanced technologies. We'd love to have American civilian nuclear technology, though we won't sign the additional protocol of the IAEA. But we're never giving up our relationship with the Chinese. They're just too important. They're a factor in global politics now. We're not going back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, where the United States was really the only player in the global stage. So this is something that the United States is going to contend with in the region. I think that Washington, under the Biden administration, has done a fairly good job in the last 2.5 years. We'll have to see what President-elect Trump does. They everybody expects them to be very, very tough on the Chinese and expects them to be very, very tough on Iran. Beyond that, we don't really know yet what President Trump is likely to do. And I would venture to say that Trump's first term is not necessarily a guide to his second term, given who he is and what's important to him and his limited attention span. That's not a political statement. That is an observable fact that the president would focus on, did not have, at least during his first term, the willingness to see through on a number of issues. That, I think, there'll be continuity from his first term to his second term.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. So there's a question from the audience here. Given all that you've said and the risk of key players hedging, waiting to see what's going to happen next, do you think it's too late? Do you think Middle Eastern states are already either going, right, this is that they're going anyway, a bit like NATO members are going to have to start thinking, well, we're going to have to just invest in our own defense now, otherwise it's not going to happen. Do you think it's too late now that the Middle East is already gone and they're already leaning towards China and other players, or is there still a chance to recover it?
Look, I think both things can happen at the same time. All of Washington's partners in the Middle East were very happy about Trump's return. I joked the other day, it's sword dance time again. I think that they like the idea of maximum pressure on Iran, although President Trump's record on Iran is not as tough as maximum pressure or as his bellicose rhetoric would suggest. I take you back to the summer of 2019, when after a number of provocative actions, the Iranians attacked 2 oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, and the president of the United States balked at responding, essentially discarding the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary to the Carter Doctrine. Now, the Gulf countries know this, but yet they still prefer the idea of maximum pressure and who they imagine is going to be around President Trump. And what I say about the Gulf states is also relevant to Israel. With Egypt, the issue is, there's going to be no concern with human rights and democratization and so on and so forth from a Trump administration. But I think there's something more fundamental that's going on, why the Gulf states in particular, like a Trump administration. President Trump runs the US government much like they run their countries. 5 guys on WhatsApp. There's no policy process. So if you can figure out who the most important influential actor is in the Trump administration, you can do a lot and go around the State Department and the Defense Department and so on and so forth. In the first administration, that was Jared Kushner. I am not a betting man. I've never bet in my life, but if I were to bet on who that person is going to be in the second administration, I would say it's Don Jr. will be that person. And so it's just much, much easier to get stuff done on their agendas if they don't have to go through the very bruising interagency process in the United States. So that is a principal reason. So all at the same time that they're happy about this, they're going to continue to work with the Chinese. As I said, the Saudis, I was in Riyadh last in late April, early May. I'm leaving Wednesday to go back. When I was last there, they said, look, we love this idea of a security pact. Bring it on. We remain interested in normalization of relations with Israel. But don't you Americans expect that we're going to give up our relationship with the Chinese. They are an important factor in the Middle East now. We sell tons of oil to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Emiratis have a very similar view. Everybody has a similar view that China is an important factor in the region. And now the United States needs to deal with it.
It's that playing into the whole idea of the shift to a multipolar world rather than just the
Exactly.
one or the two poles.
And these are muscles that, in terms of a multipolar world, these are muscles that American diplomats and the American foreign policy community has never had.
Mm.
Uh, and you can tell we're a little bit rusty on dealing with the Russia issue, Ukraine in the Middle East. If you were thinking about a bipolar world, many of the people who have been responsible for American foreign policy really came of age in the post-Cold War era. And now we've got to figure out how to deal in a multipolar world. It is, it's going to be a fascinating exercise.
Mm. And so, obviously, with what's happening in Israel, the Iran relationship is stretched again further than normal. Do you think America should still be trying to generate some sort of rapprochement between Riyadh and Tehran, or now is not the time, and that's something for further down the road?
Well, look, any reduction in tensions in the region is good because the region is very, very tense. Obviously, the Chinese were the ones who oversaw the normalization of diplomatic relations between Tehran and Riyadh. The Saudis say that the Iranians have not held up their end of the bargain, but that they are not going to blow up, pardon the pun, but they are not going to blow up the diplomatic relations that they have with the Iranians. They remain concerned about the exercise of Iranian power, but don't themselves believe that they have the wherewithal to contend with it, nor do they believe the United States has the staying power to contend with it, which is one of the reasons why they want a defense pact. Because President Trump blew off 45 years of American policy, the Saudis now want it written down. And until it's written down, they are going to hedge quite a bit. At a summit in Riyadh today, MBS said Israel should respect Iran's sovereignty. That's because he's afraid of the Iranians. If he wasn't so concerned about it, what the Israelis have done to the Iranians is a big win for the Saudis, but they just don't believe that the United States will be there to follow up. And as much as they like Trump, they are keenly aware of what happened in 2019. One word, though, on Trump's approach and maximum pressure. I don't believe that President Trump wants a direct confrontation with the Iranians. I don't believe he wants regime change. Maybe there were people around him in his first administration who wanted all of these things. At one point, I counted 7 different Iran strategies for a Trump administration, each identified with a different important person in that administration. But what the president clearly wanted was to essentially take a page from Barack Obama, who also engaged in maximum pressure, though no one ever called it that ultimately brought the Iranians to the negotiating table. And the result was the JCPOA. Well, the president-elect, the former president, now president-elect, who fashions himself as a master negotiator. I mean, the book that made him world famous was The Art of the Deal, who thinks he can settle anything, is actually interested in a deal with the Iranians, but one that's better than the one that President Obama struck. I'm sure he believes it would be better for global peace, but it's also, again, this is an observation, not a political statement. It's so he could say he got a better deal. That's what I think is really what is behind whatever Iran policy unfolds in the coming months and years.
Good. So going back to, you mentioned in a previous question, India as an overlooked player in the region. Modi and Trump got on relatively well the first time round. Do you think there's an opportunity there for a partner in the region?
You know, India is always overlooked in Washington. At the same time, India always disappoints Washington. I think there's always this expectation the United States can play the India card and we're going to be these, strategic allies and so on and so forth. And people just in New Delhi just don't look at it like that. They want to have a 360-degree foreign policy. They want to have good relations with Russia. They want to have good relations with all the Gulf states. Obviously, China is a neuralgic issue for them. but we're never going to be in lockstep with the Indians. They're always going to pursue their interests as they see fit. What I think Washington is missing is how important India is becoming to the Middle East. Just the circulation, not just of people, ideas, goods, weaponry, relations between the Gulf and Israel and the Gulf and India, and all the circulation is actually really important that I don't think that anybody really has a handle on. I mean, look, you can't go to a Gulf country and not be struck by how many people from South Asia are there that make these countries run. But I think it's more. I think it's more important than that now that India's made great strides in terms of both its economic development. These countries are hungry for economic development and investment, and Pakistan is not as much of a factor any longer for these countries. They don't want to be the wards of a failed Pakistani state. They're all opposed to the extremism that Pakistan kind of represented, and like the relationship with India. On the Israel front, they have been nurturing this relationship since the early 1990s when Shimon Peres showed up in India, and that relationship continues to develop as well. Even you finding the Indians even in Egypt, someplace that was not really a place on the map for them in a period of time. I don't think Washington understands this very well, but that India is definitely a factor here. I don't know enough about it. I'd like to know more about it. I don't know enough about it to understand how it would change the strategic calculus of the United States in the region. The Indians are certainly not going to partner with the United States in providing security and stability in the Gulf. They may be free riders, and I think that's really the issue, is that most people just want to be free riders on what the United States provides.
So potentially one to watch going forward in the next months and years.
Certainly.
So going to what is one of the bigger topics today, which is Gaza. You mentioned earlier about Trump wanting to get the best deal, and to be able to say that he's got the best deal. Obviously, also you've mentioned the US, the importance that the US attaches to Israeli security. Do you think now that the Qataris have stepped back from sort of facilitating what little negotiation they could, do you think this is something that the US might step in to try and do, or they might try a more hands-on approach and just try and shut it down a different way, or not at all?
No, I think it's somewhat different. First, a word on what the Qataris are doing. If you look at Trump's relationship with leaders in the Gulf, the one that is with whom he's most distant from is Amir Tamim. And there is a very strong, there's a strong anti-Qatari sentiment among a coalition of Republicans, whether they're pro-Israel Republicans, counterterrorism types, and for reasons that you can imagine, the idea that the anti-Taliban, that the Qataris have these groups in Doha, it could lead them to a clash with the Trump administration. I think forcing Hamas out of Doha sort of insulates Amir Tamim from whatever might be coming his way from pro-Israel, pro-Emirati, counterterrorism type Republicans, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that the Qataris, have a point. Like, look, if the Israelis and Hamas aren't interested in negotiating, what are we doing here? It is extraordinarily frustrating. In terms of what the United States is going to do, the president-elect has already told Prime Minister Netanyahu to wrap things up in Gaza by Inauguration Day. He doesn't care how he does it. I don't think this is an administration that is going to spend months and months and months searching for a ceasefire that no one wants. If the conflict continues well beyond Inauguration Day, you can see, for a variety of reasons, the Trump administration saying to the Israelis, okay, whatever gloves you might still have on, hard to imagine, can come off as long as you get this thing over with. Now, if you listen to what the recently fired Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has to say in recent days, it's basically done in Gaza. It continues because of Israeli politics. And this is the problem that Trump is going to confront, is that the Israeli timeline doesn't align with his. In addition, he's deeply committed to the idea of the Abraham Accords. And the longer this goes on, the more it puts strain on the Saudis who want to normalize. And that's clearly a target of his. This was his signature achievement in the Middle East that he would like to extend and deepen. So it is a myth. It is a myth that is perpetuated by the American media that Netanyahu and Trump are like two peas in a pod, as we say. That's not true. There's a trust deficit between the two of them. Trump was always concerned that Netanyahu was going to double cross him. Netanyahu was always concerned that Trump was, variable and could do anything and do it at any time. And so this is not going to be easy between the two. But Trump's extraordinary mandate may put Netanyahu a bit back on his heels.
Yeah, so that's one that is going to unfold one way or another.
But Netanyahu is just hammered by Israeli politics, in which his coalition partners say his coalition partners who never want to leave Gaza, who say, look, this kind of thing didn't happen before Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. They have like a tunnel vision. They think that there was no security issues prior to 2005. And you talk to the settlers, there were no problems before the Oslo Accords, and there were no problems in Gaza before 2005, which is, of course, ridiculous. But they have a more potent argument now than they have before about Gaza, and that resonates with a larger group of Israelis, given the trauma of the October 7, 2023 attacks. And so this is a problem that Netanyahu has in managing his relationship with the United States. We've seen it with Biden, and I think people are going to see it with Trump.
Yeah, no. So I guess a couple more questions before we finish. One that came in from the audience was about sort of Turkey's role. Obviously, it's the NATO ally that is closest to the region. It's got influence, especially in those countries that border it, Syria, Iraq, Iran. Where does Turkey sit in all this?
Well, I mean, President Erdogan was also very happy about the return of Donald Trump. Erdogan and Biden did not have a good personal relationship. Biden has a long history of support for Greece, and obviously a long history of support for Israel, which Erdogan was in the process of normalizing ties with when Hamas attacked Israel in 2023. And then Erdogan attacked in a different direction. But he very much welcomes the return of Donald Trump to the White House, issued a fulsome statement. Rick Grenell, who is one-time U.S. ambassador to Germany under the Trump administration and had a recess appointment as the director of national intelligence, had met with the Turkish foreign minister Hakan Fidan even before the election, and since has said, we want to have a better relationship with Turkey. It's a strong ally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is that, and Trump very much likes Erdogan. I mean, I remember during the Trump administration, anybody who had an idea about how to manage this relationship very differently would run up against the problem of the fact that President Trump liked Erdogan. I mean, the reason why there are sanctions on elements of the Turkish defense industry is not because of the president, but because he had to sign the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which no president would dare not sign. And Congress buried those sanctions within the NDAA over the S-400 and F-35 issue. So, it'll be interesting to see how they manage Turkey, but Turkey was already being brought back into the fold. The Biden administration, thankful about Sweden, whatever Turkish role they had in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. There's all this talk of F-16s. The problem is really Congress. And the problem was also Erdogan's increasingly unhinged rhetoric with regard to Israel. You cannot call the Israeli prime minister worse than Hitler because he enjoys the support of the United States and win many friends on Capitol Hill or even the White House. That was a function of Erdogan being left out of the negotiating process. He believes he has a unique relationship with Hamas, but both Egypt and Israel wanted him not involved in it, and the pressure that Erdogan was facing from his Islamist right. Under Trump, it may or may not be all that different on the Gaza front, but there will be better communication between the leaders of the two countries. And I would expect that Erdogan will get his way on American forces being in Syria and that Trump will withdraw them. Look, there's a problem. The American foreign policy community, of which I am a card-carrying member, I am a member of the establishment, I guess, has done a very, very bad job explaining to Americans why there are 1,000 American soldiers in Syria. Is it because of Syrian oil? Can't possibly be. Is it because of Russia? Is it because of Iran? What's going on there? Now, we haven't lost a lot of people there, but periodically they come under attack. Erdogan played this really well during Trump 1, and you can expect he'll play it again in Trump 2. And the people who opposed an American withdrawal from Syria are going to be nowhere near this administration. Nowhere near it. The president already said, no Mike Pompeo, no Nikki Haley. There won't be a Brett McGurk. There won't be a whole range of people who are committed to the mission in Syria. So I expect those 1,000 people will come home.
Yes. So one final question before we finish.
I'm just getting warmed up here, Charlie.
So one issue that we haven't covered is that one of the priorities you mentioned about the US is making sure that goods and energy can be shipped through the region safely, which the Houthis have interrupted periodically over the last while. And the US has very much left Yemen to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, to the Omanis to sort of
who are all saying "told you so."
Yes, exactly. So what happens next there? Is there a role for America to do something there, or not really?
Well, look, in my book, it's my pleading to American policymakers to understand what's important. I believe freedom of navigation through the Red Sea is vitally important. And so I've been accused of being a warmonger, but I think that the United States should take more sustained and devastating military action against the Houthis, who are interfering with, who now have leverage over the global economy. I don't think this has anything to do with Gaza any longer. If it ever did, they were attacking shipping periodically before Hamas attacked Israel in 2023. So I think that that's very unlikely to happen. My prescription for what we should do, the United States and the UK undertook a pretty devastating airstrikes against Houthis, but like the sources, not just, missiles that are about to be fired on shipping, really try to get at Houthi capabilities. I think there should be more of that and should be sustained. I think our Gulf partners believe that as well. I think the Emiratis and the Saudis believe that as well. But because the United States spent 10 years lecturing the Emiratis and the Saudis not that to lay off of Yemen, and humanitarian aid needed to go through the port of Hodeidah, and now we're suddenly discovering how bad the Houthis are. They're like, we're not in a position to help you any longer. I don't think that even if Trump was, they wouldn't help even if Trump wanted them to help. But I think that Trump looks at this and says, there's got to be some deal that I can make with the Iranians on this to mitigate this problem, not understanding that the Houthis are a part of the axis of resistance, but they're not like Hezbollah. They're not really integrated in the IRGC in the way that Hezbollah has become integrated in the IRGC. And I'm someone who's actually sat down and had a meal with the Houthis, with their spokespeople, and these are guys who are committed, fanatically committed to what they are doing. So I don't think that there's a deal to be had. I think that's the problem that Trump is going to find, is that he fashions himself as a deal maker and that everything is a business transaction. This is not Manhattan real estate circles. And he should know that by now, but he still seems to believe it. And the Houthis, the Iranians, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis believe certain things, believe certain irreducible things that cannot all be taken care of in some sort of negotiation with the president being like, all right, what could you give it? Can you move a little bit? Right? We've seen that. We've seen that these conflicts are existential to these people. And I think that's where Trump is going to run up against reality. And what it's going to happen is he's going to look elsewhere because he doesn't have the patience for those kinds of things. Again, not a political statement, an observable fact.
Well, we have covered quite a lot of ground in the last hour. And
like I said, I'm just getting warmed up here, but you all got to go. Veterans Day here in Washington, office is closed. And, I'll keep going if you want. No,
I think the thing is that nobody really knows what Trump's going to do. You've got it, like you said, you've got a hint of what's going to come, but you can't base it on the last administration. We don't know who his top team is in its entirety yet. We just have to wait and see. But look, a lot hinges on it.
One thing for observers to understand is that when Trump says something, he means it, right? So let's take that seriously. And in his first administration, he was stymied by a number of people around him from fully implementing his agenda. That's unlikely to happen now. So think about the things that he said that he wants to do. That's why I'm absolutely certain those 1,000 American soldiers are going to leave Syria. I can be certain of that.
Yeah. So now he's had time to regroup and come back with a well, presumably a stronger team, a more organized team. He knows what the bars are. He knows what can and can't happen, and he's got probably got the whole of Congress as well. He shouldn't have any or too many obstacles in his way. Exactly. What we can be sure of is over the next 4 years, a lot will depend on Donald Trump and the United States. So on that note, I just need to say a massive thank you for you for spending time with us today and for giving us all your insights and a fascinating discussion.
Well, it was a great pleasure. The questions were fantastic. Like I said, I'd be happy to spend more time, but hopefully we can do that again sometime soon.
Sounds good. Yes. So the next RSA event is on the 20th of November, and it's on Syed Badruddooja, an Indian politician, and his youngest daughter will be coming to speak about his life, his political principles, at a time of great change during the partition and the years that followed. But again, a massive thank you to Stephen, and we look forward to seeing you again at future events.